Number 3. Hudson River Reserve Fleet. The Hudson River Reserve Fleet was established in 1946 in the wake of World War II, and it served as a major component of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. Its main purpose was to provide an anchorage as well as a place of maintenance for a section of the excessive numbers of transports and combat vessels surplused following the return of peace. It was first located off Tarrytown. However, in late April 1946, the fleet was moved further north to Jones Point, New York, which lies at the foot of Dunderberg Mountain. The vessels were arranged in 10 rows and extended several miles, starting from the fleet office located at the Jones Point dock and ending at the Boulderberg House at Tompkins Cove. Hundreds of motorists would stop by daily to view the ships, and so several viewing points were created along Route 9W. In July of 1965, the fleet was at its peak, and it had a total of 189 ships. Throughout the Korean War, 130 of those ships were taken, leaving only 39 ships remaining. When the Suez Crisis, also known as the Second Arab-Israeli War, happened in 1956, 35 ships were added back to the fleet because French and British vessels were being diverted from their trade routes to help supply their nation's armed forces. However, more than 40 ships were required for the Vietnam War. In 1953, the U.S. Department of Agriculture needed space to store their large volumes of government-owned wheat, and so they turned to the Hudson River Reserve Fleet. Over the next 10 years, more than 53,563,948 bushels of wheat were loaded onto 231 of their ships. The last vessel filled with wheat was finally unloaded in 1963, and it said after the weight was lifted, the ship rose about 12 feet higher above the surface of the water. The large crafts were held down so much that when the wheat was removed, it even exposed a band of bright orange rust when they rose back to the surface. One interesting story regarding the fleet involves Teresa Scozzafava, who owned Barney's restaurant, which had been located at Jones Point for many years. She claimed that since she owned up to 250 feet into the water, the fleet was basically anchored in her front yard. She also stated that the ships blocked her view of the river. In retaliation, she pursued legal action in federal court with her lawyer Abraham Coppold in 1960. In her lawsuit against the U.S. Maritime Commission, which controlled the fleet, she demanded that $10 in rental fees be charged if they wanted to continue using her property. However, this case was discontinued since she did not have enough money to handle legal fees, but consequently, the fleet ended up moving further south. In order to keep the ships in tip-top condition, a crew of 86 men worked year-round under the supervision of Charles R. Gindraz. The giant vessels had to have their machinery turned over periodically, and on a regular basis, their internal surfaces needed to be sprayed with a coat of preservative oil. Electrical equipment needed constant cleaning and were coated with a fungus-retarding varnish, and rust was water blasted off hulls, decks, and superstructures. Also, at least once a year, a gray-tinted preservative oil had to be sprayed on the outside of all the ships. After all, the reserve fleet was valued at over $255 million, so any damage to the ships could have been very costly. The U.S. government was already spending on average $735,280 annually for the maintenance and preservation of the Hudson River fleet. This cost included the salaries of the workers as well as the patrol that worked around the clock to guard the ships from any unauthorized persons trying to cause trouble. The Hudson River site ultimately closed in April 1971. At this time, there were multiple other fleets that were anchored around the country in places like James River, Virginia, Olympia, Washington, Astoria, Oregon, Beaumont, Texas, Suisun Bay, California, and Wilmington, North Carolina. Less than a decade after the lawsuit was filed by Mrs. Scozzafava, the entire Hudson River Reserve Fleet was removed from Jones Point. The last two ships were sold to Spain as scrap metal on July 8, 1971. However, the majority of the ships were moved to the James River Reserve Fleet in Virginia, since it was in such close proximity to the naval base in Norfolk. Would you sue the military if a fleet of ships was anchored in front of your beach home? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Number 2. People's Liberation Army. America is known for lots of things. In today's day and age, we depend on other nations to provide goods and services for us. In fact, according to the 2021 Global Imports Report, a whopping 42% of all U.S. imports come directly from China. And as of early 2021, the U.S. government's Treasury Department released data that concludes America owes China a total of around $980.8 billion. China is quietly growing more and more powerful as time goes on. With a population of around 1.4 billion people and an economy worth over $25 trillion as of 2022, China is now the second richest country in the entire world. And at the National People's Congress that took place in early March of last year, the Chinese government increased their defense budget to about $209.16 billion based on the world's current exchange rate. With this surplus of money, you may be wondering what exactly the Chinese government spends it on. While we don't have all the facts and figures, it can be deduced that a large sum of this cash is used to support their military. And because China has the largest maritime force on the globe, it's fair to assume that a big chunk of their defense budget goes directly to the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, the Chinese Chinese Navy. The plan can be traced back to naval units who fought during the Chinese Civil War. Mao Zedong, Chinese communist and founder of the People's Republic of China, announced that in order to oppose imperialist aggression, they would have to create a powerful navy. And so the plan was established in April of 1949 by consolidating their regional naval forces under Joint Staff Department command. China's Naval Academy was created in the city of Dalian in November of 1949 and was mostly led by Soviet instructors at first. Soon after it was set up, it amassed a collection of boats and ships from the Kuomintang forces, the Chinese Nationalist Party. Just 2 years after the creation of the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Naval Air Force was added. And in 1954, there were an estimated 2,500 Soviet naval advisors working in China, and that was when the Soviet Union began to provide the Chinese military with modern ships. The plan reorganized in 1954 and 1955 and split into the North Sea Fleet, South Sea Fleet, and the East Sea Fleet. Additionally, admirals and other naval officers from the ranks of the ground forces made up another corps. At first, the Soviet Union provided the Chinese with shipbuilding, but after a while, they no longer needed the help and continued to produce vessels on their own using Soviet designs. Eventually, over time, China was able to come up with their own ship designs and no longer relied on collaboration with the Soviets. During the 1950s and the early 1960s, assistance was mostly provided by the Soviet Union to the Chinese Navy in the form of export of equipment and technology, as well as some naval advisors. The plan was mostly just a littoral force and riverine, meaning that they only functioned from a short distance from the shoreline, but that all changed in the late 1980s. When the Soviet Union fell in the 1990s, there was a shift towards a more forward-oriented security and foreign policy, and that was when the Chinese military no longer had to worry about disputes over land borders. With this newfound freedom, plan leaders could now turn their focus towards the seas. When the 21st century rolled around, China was then able to transition to a more offshore defensive strategy, and they could operate further away from their traditional territorial waters. In 2002, between May and September, the People's Liberation Army Navy completed their first ever trip around the world, if you will, and the voyage covered 32,000 nautical miles. The following year, the plan carried out its initial joint naval exercises during visits to India and Pakistan. Then, in April 2009, to demonstrate the growing status of China, between 52 and 56 ships were shown in maneuvers off Qingdao, which included never-before-seen Chinese nuclear submarines. The plan is growing at alarming rates, and according to the Defense Department in 2021, China has an inventory of about 355 vessels, making it the biggest maritime force on the planet. Within the next 4 years, they're slated to expand their inventory to more than 420 ships. Then, by 2030, the plan is expected to increase their numbers to a total of 460 vessels, this according to reports from the Pentagon's annual China military estimate. From that same report, we know that the plan is now pursuing both long-range strike capabilities as well as new anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The Pentagon has even stated that they expect China to equip their nuclear attack boats with land attack cruise missiles, and in coming years they could develop nuclear attack submarines. With their vast fortune and ever-growing population, who knows what they could be capable of? And for any military that might need to defend themselves against them, it's honestly terrifying to think about. Number 1. Greek Navy, Battle of Salamis. We'll now go back in time to 480 BC when the Greeks fought against the Persians in the Battle of Salamis. This was a naval battle that took place within the Straits of Salamis, which is an island near Athens in the Saronic Gulf. This fight marked the climax of the Second Persian invasion of Greece. In order to stop the advance of the Persian forces, the pass of Thermopylae was blocked by a small group of Greeks. At the same time, an Athenian-dominated allied navy engaged in combat against the Persian fleet in the nearby Artemisium Straits. The Greeks were defeated in these battles, but they would soon win the war. They were hit hard by the Persians and completely annihilated in the Battle of Thermopylae. However, the forces that still survived from the Battle of Artemisium retreated to Salamis Island after hearing of their defeat across the water. Even though they were severely outnumbered, the Athenian general Themistocles was able to persuade the Greek allies to oppose the Persian fleet once more. If they were able to achieve victory, it would most certainly prevent any further naval operations against them. From the other side of things, the Persian king Xerxes was eager and ready for a decisive battle. Themistocles was a very intelligent and calculated strategist, and he came up with a plan to once and for all crush the Persian fleet. He understood that the ships under Xerxes' control did not have much experience navigating through highly populated waters, and so he sent a message directly to the Persian king, letting him know exactly where the Greek fleet was stationed. Xerxes may have been feeling a little too confident after their last 2 victories against the Greek allies, and he didn't think twice before commanding his entire Persian navy to sail directly to Salamis. He thought he would easily be able to overpower the Greeks, But this was all just a part of Themistocles' plan. When the Persians arrived in the Straits of Salamis, they attempted to block off both entrances. However, their forces became disoriented and disorganized as they were trying to sail through the cramped waters. Seeing that the enemy was at a large disadvantage, the Greek fleet seized the opportunity. It's reported that in total the Greeks had 310 triremes, ancient ships with 3 banks of oars, in the Allied fleet that fought in the Battle of Salamis. Under the command of Themistocles, the fleet was extremely effective. Xerxes was surprised to find that when they arrived at Salamis, the Greek fleet was ready and waiting for them. The Greeks were also able to take advantage of restricted waters that were between the mainland and Salamis, something that Xerxes did not account for. In the end, the Greeks won by using their sturdier and heavier ships to ram against the Persian vessels, forcing them into submission. The Persian fleet was mostly made up of ships that were designed for increased maneuverability. However, they lacked the open water they needed during this battle. Xerxes was ultimately defeated, and although the Greek fleet may not have been the largest naval force, it most certainly was one of the greatest. Thanks for watching. If you could go back in time to meet some of the greatest military leaders of all time, who would you want to meet? Let us know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time for some more amazing videos right here on American Eye.